So in this video I'm going to be painting this simple three-color forest scene, and the techniques that I'll demonstrate are the foundations for creating more elaborate and detailed paintings like some of these. So hopefully you can watch and learn something from this video. I'm just going to be painting on this chunk of wood here that I've sanded, and to get started I'm going to prime it with a burnt sienna. And I'll just cover the whole thing here. Three colors I'm going to use for the painting are burnt umber, cerulean blue, and titanium white. Got some pretty simple flat brushes. I'm using a cup of water, and I've got some paper towel for cleaning up my brushes. So with my primer dry, I'll start by painting the background. I'm just going to start by trying to get a nice light color. I'll use white, blue, and brown all together, trying to keep it on the lighter side. And I know I want my background scene to be brightest in the middle, so that's where I'll lay down my lightest color. And really just simple brush strokes, nothing too fancy, no details in mind. And as I get a little further away from the center, I'll increase the amount of color I'm using. Still using mostly white, but adding a little bit more blue, a little bit more brown. And I'm just sticking with a loose brush stroke. Even though I know I want to paint a forest, I'm not worried about trying to make anything look like trees at this point. Just blocking in some color, and what I'm thinking about in my mind for the painting is that these are just distant trees, distant shrubs. In the finished painting they'll fall into the background and not require a whole lot of detail. So I can just block in this color at this point. I'll continue to add a little bit more blue and a little bit more of that umber each time I reload my brush. I'll just finish off blocking in the background like this. Maybe I'll get a little bit darker as I get down near the bottom where I know my horizon is going to be. And I'll just speed that up to finish that off. Now with some of those same middle tones that I ended up with, I can pretty quickly get to putting in some trees here. And with that flat brush, I'll just use the narrow edge of it flat on the edge of my surface and just drag some trees in. You could make these brush strokes from the bottom up. I'm doing it from the top down, whatever's comfortable. And here too, they're just single brush strokes, not worried about anything fancy as far as details. So I'll just drop these in wherever. Maybe just try and change up the width of them so they're not all identical. Maybe some different angles of trees, different thicknesses. They don't all have to be perfectly straight. They can kind of overlap and intersect. If I think about a real forest, there's so much going on. It's so busy, and branches and trees hanging in every direction. Important thing here is just not to get too dark with these brush strokes, because I want these to fall into the background in the finished product. I'll stick with that same brush and the same color value, and I can build in a little bit of tree detail. Just maybe these are some pine trees and they've got some branches hanging down, and just little light touches of my brush can create those shapes pretty quickly. And I'm just trying to stay loose with these brush strokes, not worry about too much precision and detail. Just general tree shapes and branches, leaves. Now if I come back in here with a lighter color than I started with, maybe a little bit more white, I can block in some little areas where the light is peeking through in the forest. And kind of working in reverse here, cutting out the negative space, I can show where maybe there's some light coming through some trees in the background. And on a larger painting, this can be a huge time saver. Instead of painting the details of every little branch and every little gap between the trees, I can just kind of carve out some of these spots where the light is peeking through, and pretty quickly it just creates another extra layer and the illusion that there's a little bit more space back there. And as this painting progresses, I'll continually go back and brighten up some of these spots and find the spots where the light is coming through the most. Just kind of moving around and finding some little gaps where light is peeking through. So now if I go back with a darker value, I'm still using white, but maybe a little bit more of my blue and my umber. Now I can put another layer of trees, and these are just those same either bottom up or top down brush strokes using the thin edge of the brush. And if I was able to get a value that's a little bit darker than before, I'll already start to create some contrast and another layer. It brings these trees closer to the viewer. And I'll use some of that dark color along the bottom to just kind of flesh out where my foreground or my horizon is going to be. And I'm just painting over other things in the background. If there's something interesting in the background, then I won't cover it up necessarily, but just kind of dropping these in anywhere. Maybe what I'm trying to focus on is keeping that center area somewhat open. And where I put these trees is pretty random. I do like to have trees that are leaning or hanging or just falling at odd angles. To me, it just looks a little bit more believable and realistic. Anytime I'm out in the forest, I can't help but look at all the trees that are falling down and broken and leaning up against each other. And to me, that just adds interesting things to look at in a painting. Maybe there's just a stump here where a tree broke off. I can use that thin edge of the brush to create some branches. There's probably better brushes for doing some of that, but I can get a pretty quick effect of branches just using that thin edge of the brush with light pressure. I'm not too worried about making any of these perfect or having, a huge number of offshooting branches. Just some here and there to break up my vertical trees. And just letting them run off the edge of my painting surface too, it helps make it look like this scene just continues on beyond my little 4-inch block of wood here. And I'm not afraid to overlap things and let them all kind of intertwine. Now with a nice light color, I can go back to my background again and not repaint everything, but just here and there hit a nice bright spot where some of the light is peeking through the trees. And I can clean up some edges and sort of shape out some of these background trees, show a little bit more form to them by having the light peek through. It just adds to the busyness of a painting and makes it look like there's a lot more going on by just doing a really simple step. I'm just using little light touches of the corner of that brush and turning the brush just so I get different shapes to my marks so they're not all the same everywhere. And it helps to bring my background to life and shows little gaps between things and creates the illusion of a lot more branches and leaves back there. Alright, if I go back to a darker color here, mostly blue and umber, I can start to bring a little bit more light and shadow to some of my foreground trees. And you'll notice I'm not just painting the whole tree with that dark color. I'm just lightly using the edge of the brush and kind of hitting the side of that tree to maybe show that that's the side in shadow. And I won't necessarily do this to every tree or every branch, just the ones that I think are closest to me in my point of view. You can see how I'm just using the edge of that brush to kind of skim and just make a variety of marks. Definitely my foreground and the surface in front of me can get nice and dark. Just hit a handful of these tree trunks and branches that I think can be brought forward. Now my painting is mostly blue, but if I use a little bit of white and some of my umber, I can get another value in there, and I'll use that to kind of create a highlight on the side of some of those trees. Same thing here, I'll just hit the ones that I think are closest to me. Those would have the most amount of detail. And I'm doing the same thing, just using the edge of that brush and just making some little marks, not necessarily changing the color of the whole tree. Now here I'm back to a darker value, and it's like a step I did earlier where I just block in some tree shapes, very random, and just letting the brush skip around so I don't just make the same mark over and over. And when you're painting landscapes and trees, you can really get away with a lot as far as different shapes and marks. And your brain is going to fill in the gaps and tell you that they're tree branches and leaves. I'm just trying to let all my layers work together here. The light of my background, the dark of my trees, all of those things create contrasts and trick you into seeing a little bit of depth and distance. So you can see how I'm not covering up some of those light areas that I have peeking through. I'll use that same technique for maybe some shrubs on the ground or little leaves and branches sticking up. Now you can see I'm into mostly white here, and I'm just going back to my background once more and really brightening up some key spots where I think the light is peeking through the most. And I'll try not to overdo this so that the whole background doesn't become that bright white. Here and there I'll find some spots and just brighten them up a little bit more. Now I'm back to my dark values again. I'm just going to go over some of these trees and some of those tree branches. The first layer was a little bit transparent, so I'm just going to darken them up again, and that will turn them into more of a flat silhouette shape. Just go over some of those tree trunks, and you can see how that second layer sort of covers the transparency, brings them to the front a little bit more. Now using a little bit of white and my umber, I'd go on and put a little bit more of a highlight on some of these dark trees. Just little touches, establishing an edge. On a larger painting, you could definitely take your time with a step like that and build up more detail. For something simple like this, I just need a little bit of highlight to show some shape. You can see how I'm just making little touches here and there. Nothing too crazy. Take one more layer of some dark color to really bring my foreground into view. Maybe have some of that dark color creep up some of my closest trees. And then one more pass at some of my tree branches and leaves. And as a finishing step here, I've got this little liner brush, and using some water mixed into my darkest colors, I can make a little bit more detail here. Nice and crisp tree branches, and definitely you could go to town on a much larger and elaborate painting with things like this. Just having those nice dark brush strokes in contrast with that light background just kind of brings all the layers into play. And the trick for me to pay attention to is to try not to make the same branch over and over again, which I'm guilty of often. Try to change up the direction and the bends and the breaks and where they split. I'm not afraid to overlap things and just kind of have things run together. Kind of skip around the rest of the painting here and maybe add a few branches here and there. The little liner brush can be great for finishing details. I think I'll call that a painting. And the steps that I used here can definitely be applied to something much larger, and certainly if you added more colors and spent a little bit more time within each layer building up details, you could have a much more elaborate painting. So something like this can be good to practice with a simple amount of colors and simple techniques, and hopefully you can use that in your painting. Thanks for watching.